And today I will be telling you about pedigree analysis, and we will be doing some questions. Number first is, for to solve the pedigree analysis questions, you should know that there can be few types of inheritance. Number one is maternal inheritance, in which the affected mother will pass on the disease to all the offsprings. Maternal inheritance, in which the affected mother will pass on the disease to all the offsprings. These are all basics: autosomal recessive, autosomal dominant, X-linked recessive, and X-linked dominant. So what is the pattern which you have to follow while considering a pedigree analysis questions? The first thing you have to check out is for maternal inheritance. If you see maternal inheritance, that means the affected mother is passing the disease to all the offsprings. That means it is maternal inheritance. The second thing you have to check whether it is dominant or recessive. If you get to know that the disease is not maternal inheritance, that means it can be either autosomal or it can be X-linked. So if autosomal or X-linked, it has to be either dominant or it has to be either recessive. So second point you have to check is whether it is dominant or recessive. In case of dominant, you will not see any generation gap, and in case of recessive, you will see some generation gap. Now after you know that the disease is not maternal inheritance, it is dominant or recessive, you know that which one it is. Then you have to check whether it is autosomal or X-linked. For autosomal or X-linked, you have to check out X-linked, sex-linked. If it is sex-linked, that means it is if it is not sex-linked, that means it is autosomal. So for sex-linked, you have to check whether there is criss-cross inheritance. Criss-cross inheritance means X chromosome of father will be passed on to the daughter, and then it will be passed on to the grandson. If the disease is dominant, that means the affected father will pass the disease to all the daughters, and if the disease is recessive, affected mother will pass the disease to all the sons. You have to either remember these points or understand it. If you will make a pedigree chart of all these cases, then you will understand it easily. And there is a small note: if both father and mother are unaffected and the progeny is affected, that means it is a recessive disorder. It is most likely to be a recessive disorder. Now we will proceed to some examples, and let's see how they goes. Now the first example is this. The options are all. It can be either maternal inheritance, autosomal recessive, autosomal dominant, X-linked recessive, or X-linked dominant, or Y-linked. So in this case, I see that the mother is unaffected and the father is affected, and all the three childs are unaffected. Mother is affected in the second generation, and all sons are affected. That means it is a clear-cut case of maternal inheritance. Affected mother will pass on the disease to all the offsprings. Now we move on to the second example. Now I have to check whether it is maternal inheritance or not. I see that the mother is normal, but the disease is passed to a son and a daughter. That means it is not maternal inheritance. Now, first is not maternal inheritance. Second is I have to check whether it is dominant or recessive. Both parents are unaffected, but the daughter and the son are affected. That means it cannot be dominant. It has to be recessive. Now the third is whether it is X-linked or recessive. So we know that X-linked or autosomal. Now we know that the disease is recessive. That means if the disease has to be X-linked, she has to be XC and XC. If XC is the affected chromosome, and he has to be XC and Y. Okay. So for this to happen, here has to be an XC chromosome and here has to be minimum one XC chromosome. Now if the disease is recessive and the father has XC chromosome, that means he should be affected, but he is not affected. That means the disease is not X-linked. If it was X-linked, then that means she has to be XC, and for this to happen, the father has to has affected X chromosome, and because the male has only one X chromosome, that means he will show the disease or the symptoms, but he does not show. That means the disease is autosomal. So we come to the conclusion that the disease is autosomal and recessive. Now we'll move on to the next example. In this we see that for first we have to look out for maternal inheritance. The father is affected, no progeny affected. Mother is normal, but the progeny is affected. That means maternal inheritance is not there. Number two, I have to look for whether it is recessive or dominant. I see a clear-cut generation gap. No disease. That means it is a recessive disorder. Now I have to look out whether it is X-linked or whether it is autosomal. So I see that the affected father has an affected grandson. This is a clear-cut example of crisscross inheritance. Affected father means he has XCY. As the disease is recessive, mother can be XX or XCX. So he will pass on his X chromosome to the daughter. That means daughter has XCX and XCX, and the son will have XY. Now this affected X chromosome will be passed on to the grandson. That means he will get affected. So this is a clear-cut example of crisscross inheritance. Affected X chromosome from the father is passed on to the daughter, and then it is passed on to the grandson. Now we'll move on to that means it is X-linked recessive disorder. Now we'll move on to the next example. In this number first we have to rule out maternal inheritance. Mother is affected, but all the offsprings are not affected. So we see that this is not affected. That means it is not maternal inheritance. Number two, we have to look out whether it is recessive or dominant. We see that this generation has a disease, this generation has disease, this has disease. That means it is a dominant disorder. Now I have to look out whether it is autosomal or whether it is sex-linked. So I said when the disease will be dominant, the affected father will have to pass on the disease to all the daughters. This is the affected father and this is the affected father. So he has an affected chromosome X, he has an affected chromosome X, and he is passing the disease to daughter, he is passing the disease to daughter, he is passing the disease to daughter. That means it is an example of X-linked dominant disorder because it follows the rule that affected father, in a case of dominant condition, affected father will pass on the disease to all the daughters. I hope you guys understand this. If you have any queries, you can definitely write it in the comments, and you can also write your reviews if you want any improvements. I know that I can't write properly on this paint, but thanks for watching and I hope you guys like it. Please do subscribe me.